welcome to a new episode of the Language Surfers podcast. I'm happy and grateful to have today with me Kathrin and Keith. Thank you both for accepting the invitation and being here with me today. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, yes.
Great. So today we are gathering to talk about a book that you recently launched, which is called Clinical Trials, Signed, Sealed and Recruited. And I'm glad that I can have both of you here so that we can talk about this book because it really caught my attention. But before we go into the conversation regarding the book and its content, would you be able to tell us a bit about yourself, your background, where are you based, so that the audience knows a bit more about the authors?
Kathrin?
Yeah, I was just going to say Keith. Thank you, Keith, gentlemen. Kathrin, obviously. I am a former nurse with 20 years and more experience in like the medical field. And I've been working as a medical communicator the past 3 years. Started as a translator and then got more and more into communication, like writing and blog writing, SEO writing, all this. And I focused on cancer and clinical trial content. And then I wrote my first book, How to Speak Cancer. And I also have a podcast, Med Talks with Kathrin. And both of those, like the book and the Med Talk, joined me with Keith. And that's where we met, which is a nice way to shift over to Keith.
So I'm Keith. I'm the loudmouth on LinkedIn who doesn't stop posting and so on. I'm a scientist by training. I've worked in clinical research for 25 plus years, initially on the academic side and then predominantly on commercial clinical trials, really focusing in on the operations and the patient engagement. Today I run my own company, so we have a clinical trial finder platform called PRX Trialport, and we just help explain to people, or firstly we surface clinical trials and then explain those trials in plain language in the most human way possible, and we use behavioral psychology to help make those studies relatable, improve competence awareness, remove some of the cognitive load and the fog that sits around this, so people can really make that decision. Yes, I want to participate in clinical trials. This is the trial for me, and then be able to see that trial through to the end. And as Kathrin said, we met a little while ago. I also chair one of the ethics committees in the UK. That's where I'm based, although my company's based in the US. But really, in today's world, we all work globally, so we're all in different places around the world, even on this call. So we need to work in that capacity.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for describing what you're doing, and I think you make the perfect combination of co-authoring this book. So first, before we go again into the content of the book, where did you get the idea from to start and to co-author such a book, and how was the co-authoring process? Because sometimes, when you write the book just by yourself, it's one process, but when you write it with another partner, it definitely has its own benefits and challenges maybe. How was it for you?
Keith, now you may start.
Well, Kathrin was a slave driver. She made me write 200-300 words in that. It was
It's not true.
I think we started, I think it came about because Kathrin had made a comment on one of her podcasts about something I'd written, and then we started talking, and then she told me about her book on cancer. And I bought the book actually for a family member, and I just liked the way that she wrote. I'd always wanted to write a book rather than just piecemeal information out in LinkedIn posts and other social media. And I don't know, we just started talking about it, and the co-authoring piece was actually for me the easiest piece, because we've got different domain expertise, we come from different perspectives. Kathrin is brilliant in terms of bringing this all together. I have my ideas of what this would look like, and some of the human elements and so on. And I think that overall, it was just a very simple, fluid process because we both knew what we wanted to do. We knew what the destination was, and knowing your destination in anything is key. And we kind of just navigated our way to that. We looked at the chapters, worked out where do we feel most comfortable writing. And then, I mean, some of these chapters I was able to write in hours, just because it was all there and it flowed. So, Kathrin, I don't know if that was your perception, but for me, this was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, well, I remember actually how it started was that was sometime in September, just before I launched my book. And I wanted to interview you for my Med Talk because I found PRX Engaged, it was the name there back then, extremely interesting. And the opinion of Keith, everything he posted, I found it really interesting. And I wanted to interview you. And then we had the Med Talk. And we got more and more into talking about, like, we were on the same level directly, like patient first, patient voice, and patients need to understand what's going on. And I think even, if I remember right, it was that I sent you because in my book, in the How to Speak Cancer book, I have one chapter about clinical trials. And I sent that to you. I don't know why, but I did. And you were saying, yeah, I really liked it. And when I wrote that chapter, I think I even have in the introduction that this chapter actually deserves an own book, because clinical trials are so, there's so much to say about it. But obviously I had the other book, but I didn't want to drop it. I remember talking to a friend who had a brother freshly diagnosed with cancer when I wrote the How to Speak Cancer book. And I asked her, would you think that should be part of the book, or is it too overwhelming? And then she said, yeah, it should be in the book, but you can't overdo it because there's too much information. So back then already I knew there is going to be a second book about clinical trials. But to be honest, I didn't have enough experience in the clinical trial field. So when I met Keith and when he read the chapter and asked if we are if I would be keen on writing the book together, I was completely happy because yes, I wanted to write a book, but I needed expertise. And this is where we just fit together so well. And then also the process, it was so smooth and easy. I remember our first call was on the 18th of October, and that was our kickoff call. And not even an hour, we had the whole setting of the book, like the whole outline, not line out. And Keith said to me, this was one of the most effective calls I've ever had, because we were just like brainstorming and everything fit in so well. And I remember the whole process was just really smooth and easy. But I think that's because we are both driven people and passionate people. We did it with a passion and we had the same goals. So it wasn't hard. I had a bit of respect to write a book, because I'm like, English is not my first language, and to write a book in English with someone who is like English, I really had respect. And I remember the first chapter when I sent it to Keith, because we edited, I read his and he read mine, reviewed. I was so nervous. I was like, oh gosh, really? I don't even want. Yes, I didn't even want to know what you write. But yeah, I was glad it went well.
Like I think what also worked and why it clicked so quickly is that we weren't coming at this from, this is our first journey through patient engagement or clinical trials or how to talk to people. You know, we've both been working for a long time, and therefore, you know, all those years of I wouldn't call it expertise, but like real world experience is far easier to then break this down. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book is, you know, whether it's speaking to patients or speaking to clinical sites, or even those in the biotech and pharma industry and the community groups, everyone's perception was quite different. And I thought, well, you know, we need to show people that they can or don't have to, but ultimately it's up to them. and show the different perspectives. I think, one of the bits that we brought into the book were people's own journeys, whether that was their own health journey or their journey through industry or why they do what they do. It was so important to bring that across, because Kathrin's journey and my journey was so different, yet we could see similarities and differences, and that's why the whole thing happened so quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the book so special, because you bring together a lot of perspectives. And definitely, while you were mentioning, Kathrin, it was also in my mind the word passion, that just how you speak, and the fact that you had the idea. And how long did it take you? 1 year?
No, it was on 18th October. We had our kickoff call, and the 21st of February we published. It was crazy. We were like, did we really do that so fast? So yeah.
Wow.
Everything was there.
I said 1 year, but oh my gosh, you were super. Definitely.
3 months.
But if everything's there, it's just about how you formalize it on the page. And as I said, there were one chapter I wrote in a matter of hours. I then left it for a few weeks, came back and read it again. I mean, we must have read this over and over.
Yeah.
Even when it got to that very final stage where we had our proof copy done, I've still got my proof copy. There's tons of red lines and markers in there. Well, why did I say this? Change this round. The point was, the book was to come across as a conversation with people, not a educational book. It's educational in one way, but it's supposed to be an informative book, but not guide you down a particular way. It's not a textbook. And I think when you write in a conversational manner, it just flows better.
Yeah, for me it was also really important to show like people who are thinking about trials, that there are real people behind the scenes. A clinical trial seems to be so sterile and so cold. If you only hear the words like clinical trials, they have like a complete different language than we usually use, and that can seem very distant and cold. And for me it was so awesome to see how, to learn the stories behind, also the stories from your people, Keith. They were so interesting and just really inspiring, and also showing, I hope, people that this is not a clinical thing. It's there's people with stories. Why are we in clinical trials engaged? I mean, we all have our stories. So this was very interesting for me, and also inspiring. And then we just set ourselves a deadline, and we are both like doers. We don't, Keith never sleeps. That helps too.
And I think it was about taking something out of the abstract and making it relatable. So, even when I came to Kathrin with the idea, well, let's include people's personal journeys, then we discussed it, agreed on that, but it was also about then having their name and having their picture, because then you can actually see the person and you can visualize what's going on. Then Kathrin said, well, we should have some way of making this relatable, whether it be in the way that we tell the story. So we chose geography and the environment and so on. And then Kathrin had the idea in terms of the illustrations, because one of Kathrin's daughters and my daughter, or my eldest daughter, are good with this kind of thing. So they contributed as well, which made this even more of a passion project than just we've got to get this out. And we didn't set ourselves or them crazy deadlines. We obviously set a deadline to do this, but if we missed it, okay. In the end, we didn't, because it just came naturally. And I've seen colleagues write books and, I've got to write another 2 pages or another 5 pages today, and it becomes a chore, and it should never be a chore. If that's the case, stop it, walk away, leave it be.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And also, why did we choose geography? I remember that conversation too. Like, we wanted to use metaphors. This is like medical storytelling is something that is very close to my heart, because my passion is, or my mission is actually to make medical language understandable for everyone. And how do we achieve that? We achieve that through visualization of different, like, difficult terms. And we discussed that, and that was also one part of the book that Keith liked, like the cancer book, How to Speak Cancer. And then we discussed which kind of metaphor do we want to use. And for me personally, nature, we are all a piece of nature, and then this is also where I feel like most at home is in the forest. And then we just agreed to keep the nature, because this is where we come from and this is where we go to. So and it's very calming too. We wanted something calm, right? So to get even more warmth in this whole procedure, in the book. And to be fair, we had great stories, so we didn't even have to work so much, because other people wrote their stories for us. So yeah, thank you.
It's amazing the idea that you had and how you put everything together. And the next thing that I would like to focus on, because you've already touched on it, is the structure of the book. Because as you well mentioned, Kathrin, when we say clinical trial, it's something that seems so professional, so distant, cold. But then in the structure of the book, there's one thing that you say that at the core of the clinical trials there are people. And what you basically do is engage with patients, caregivers, researchers, and advocates. So you bring to the table a lot of perspectives, right? To have the complete picture of clinical trials. But before we go into the structure of the book, maybe for the audience, would you be able to just summarize in a very easy way what clinical trials are and why they seem so difficult for people to understand? And then you bring your human touch in the writing of the book.
Keith, go for it.
Okay. So a clinical trial at its heart is a science experiment where we have a hypothesis of, we believe that this drug or this intervention will have this impact and will not cause X, Y, and Z side effects, and it will help a person in whichever way. And, that is important to get that across, but the way that we've done this to date in the industry has been very scientific, very clinical. I'd say only really in the last 2 to say 5 years, we've taken a far softer, more patient-focused, I hate the word patient-centric, but patient or person-focused approach to this. A clinical trial is, for some people, an opportunity to learn more about themselves or their medical history. For others, it's an opportunity to finally put to rest some symptoms, and for others, it is a cure. For some, it is that last lifeline of hope. For every person, it's a different thing, and for some people, it's I will never do this in my entire life because it's not for me. And that's fine as well. And that's why we said signed, sealed, delivered. It's your yes or no. It's up to you as to whether or not you take part in the clinical trial. It is an intense process for people. It is something that I think people don't realize how intense it can be because they're not thinking about it up front, and also not necessarily thinking about it in relation to day-to-day life, in relation to anxieties and stresses of whatever condition they're living with. And so, clinical trials now need to adapt and change to today's life, where we don't just do what our doctor tells us, nod our head and go to a clinical trial or take the medication they say. But equally, it shouldn't just be that we take the standard of care. Clinical trials for some people are the only opportunity, or for others, they are the opportunity to try a different medication that may not result in the side effects that the drugs on the market give. That for me is why I looked at a clinical trial for when I had my what turned out to be a false positive diagnosis of prostate cancer. You know, male incontinence, impotence, these are side effects of therapies for prostate cancer. And at the time I was 47, I went, I don't want that for the next 50, 60, 100 years that I'm going to be around. So I looked at clinical trials. But then if you make these studies so clinical, so dehumanized, so hard to understand, you take that huge amount of willingness. About 80% of people that we polled would take part in a clinical trial, yet only 20-30% ever do. And why? It's because we make it too hard.
Yeah, and I think that's what you clearly explain in the book through the stories of people involved. And I think there's one chapter that particularly got my attention, of a father, I think it was Jamie Tierney,
Yeah.
who had his son with a rare disease. And what really got my attention, and again I highlight this human touch when you describe clinical trials, because he said, and I'm going to read it, for me it is something completely different. It is about hope. And I think that's super important, because as you mentioned, sometimes there are lots of patients who would like to engage, but because the process is so rigorous and it seems so difficult, they have no idea how to engage or what it means to sign that informed consent. But for others, when you are at a specific stage where you really need a solution, you engage in a clinical trial with a lot of hope.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really
Yeah.
a special moment when
Yeah.
I read the book.
So Jamie, like a lot of people that I speak to, I'm sure Kathrin does as well, stand out. You know, that word hope is something that people hold on to. But Jamie's an incredible person in terms of what he does. Not because of what he does, because there are a lot of people that do what, I mean, I would walk over hot coals for my children. But he verbalizes it and he communicates it and he shares and he makes the process relatable and he shows other people that, you know, you can speak up too, and we're here for you and I'm here for you. And so I love Jamie. I'll say it.
Yeah.
You know, I met Jamie earlier last year, and I've been fortunate to walk that journey with him and his son through the clinical trial that they went on to, from before they went on to the trial, through all the stresses and the aches and the pains and everything else that are related to a trial, to still being on the trial now, but seeing his son doing things and Jamie sharing with me things his son has not done before or for a long time. That's incredible, and that all comes from that seed of hope, and that hope is what grows. And you know, if anyone takes anything from the book, is there are all these amazing people pushing for the same thing, which is a better world environment for you, me, and everyone else.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you also touched on the book about localization or translation, right? Because when we talk about clinical trials, it's not just in one particular country, but rather you have to make it accessible all over the world. And apart from everyone engaged in the clinical trial and the patients themselves, I think that the role of translators and interpreters is also fundamental.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely.
I think thank you for saying that, because if you want to translate clinical trial content, then you must understand what is a clinical trial first. The more you know about the topic you're translating, the better your translation gets. Of course, it's not just about terms. It's especially about understanding the process. And as I say when I give courses about medical writing or translating, I always have a patient sitting with me on my desk, and I always wonder, would that patient, like I had, or for example, like it's a very good example, I had an ICF to translate for a phase 1 study, and the inclusion criteria was stage 4, I think it was breast cancer and a lot of comorbidities. And so I saw the patient was very, very sick. And from my practical experience as a nurse, I know what those patients look like. So I imagine that patient sitting next to me, and then I went to the chapter, or I came to the side effects, adverse events, and I read through that, and I translated it, and I started crying, because I was like, if you take the risk of experiencing all this just to get maybe a week, a month, or whatever longer, or to leave something behind for someone else with that kind of diagnosis, you must be such a strong person, but also maybe so desperate because there's no other choice. So I had a lot of mixed feelings there, and yeah, as I said, when, like, to my mentees, I always say, have that patient sitting with you on the desk, and then you do a good job. But to imagine that patient, if you don't have a clinical background, you need to dive into the topic, and this is why I think this book can really help linguists to understand the topic. Because one of my favorite chapters is the one that Keith wrote about, the misunderstandings and the fears, and I think that is a tremendously important part to talk about, because most of the people don't do that, especially from the industry. They don't dare to talk about it because they don't want to, as we say in German, wake sleeping dogs. They don't want to give people the idea, oh, maybe there is something wrong about it. But I think we are very transparent and clear about that too, and I really love that chapter too.
Yeah, and just on that chapter, I think what is so important, if you look at the world and how clinical trials have developed, I wanted to put a bit of history on clinical trials in the book as well, because we've been doing clinical trials for hundreds of years. But we've also been abusing people in clinical trials for a very long time. And I think it's important that we acknowledge what was wrong in the past so that people understand they can start to trust us or look to trust us again in the future. And it's something I talk about quite frequently is, if you hide behind or you try to ignore, not ignore, but just like put to the side previous transgressions, no one's going to trust you. And in fact, there'll be a lot of respect if you say, we stuffed this up. We made a real mistake here. But this is what we're doing to course correct. Again, even on a clinical trial, just speaking with the patient saying, this didn't go how we wanted. It could be an appointment gets misbooked, or it could be that something changes, or, there's an effect that we weren't expecting. It could be a meal doesn't turn up how it should do. Acknowledge the transgression, and you either maintain or you gain the trust of the person. Because if you don't, we will continue in this world where if I say the word clinical trials, people go, that's not for me.
Yeah.
Without even thinking.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think trust is another key word.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we've got nowadays informed consent forms, right? And here I would like to talk with you about the topic of language in clinical trials and in ICFs, in the sense that we know that the language can be somehow technical for people to understand. And what's your perspective of how can we be more open to help people understand patients, right? Depending on their language and level of literacy, right? How can we make this technical and professional language, which definitely is relevant for regulatory bodies and to keep a certain level, but when we engage with patients, from your experience, how can we make it more close to people to engage with patients?
So, Kathrin, do you mind if I start with this one?
No, you go first. Yeah.
For me, if you cannot tell a family member, a friend, what their trial is about in 2-3 minutes, having read the information, then that document hasn't worked. Secondly, when putting together these patient information sheets, these informed consents, whatever it happens to be, anything you're putting out to a patient, think about, would I want my mother, my daughter, my son, my father, my uncle, whatever, would they understand what I'm trying to get across here, and would they trust what I'm saying? And would they have the information they need to make the decision, this is or isn't for me? And if you cannot instantly answer that with a yes, go back and do it again, or make it simple, or look at the language. You know, there is some language that we cannot just simply take out because it has to be there. But then if that's the case, take a second, explain it. That's what we do with our platform and so on. You know, we take more complex language and we turn it into plain language summaries and so on. But there are certain words that or terms that are in there that if I didn't have it in there, I'd have to write 2-3 lines around it. So you make the burden bigger because you're talking around the topic. Leave it in there, but provide the explanation as well. And it makes it clear to people.
Well, in my opinion, we need to start in the very top. Like, I can give you a whole lesson about how to write patient-friendly. It's short sentences. It's easy. It's again what I said before. That it's not just your mom, it's your sick mom. It's someone like, I gave a course 2 weeks ago about clinical trial translations for patients. And I always use in my courses an example patient. So I had Alex there, he had a glioblastoma. He was only 27 years old. This is a patient I actually really had cared for once. He was very young, he just got a baby and he had a glioblastoma, a brain tumor. And then he got the ICF. Let's stick to the ICF. And he was completely overwhelmed. And of course, it's a lot of information, but also when you have a brain tumor, you have a decreased cognitive ability to digest anything. And then he is in pain, he is in fear, he has seizures, he is tired, he is anxious, he has his kid to take care of, he has his partner who is also anxious, he has a lot of emotional burden. So the whole sphere, the space you have in your head to digest anything is very low, it's very tiny. And this is something you have to have in mind when you start writing anything for patients. And then again, we have to write a lot of stuff in those ICFs. But there are simple techniques to keep it easier. Some sentences in English are already quite long and contain a lot of, commas and, really long sentences. When you translate that into German, they become even longer because German has many more words to use for like in English. So break the sentences down. Again, medical storytelling, use easy everyday language to explain difficult terms. Mm-hmm. Then again, we have the ICF. We have to write everything in there, what is in there. But we have also a summary. And this summary can be very plain. And you can also develop a brochure, which is a bit more than a summary, but not the whole thing, And I have many ideas. I could talk about that forever. How to make it easier, digestible.
Look, if you think about the psychology behind this for a second, and you look at something called cognitive load, and that's something that we actually base our platform, one of the principles we base our platform on. You've got the intrinsic load, that's the science, the procedures. You can't not share that information with the person. But then you've got the extraneous load. This is the commas, how you've presented the information. That's where you can vary the amount of information that you're giving. Speaking in short sentences, as Kathrin says, use bullet points where you don't have to use long format writing. You want to reduce that extraneous load as much as possible because you only have limited memory. And if your extraneous load is taking up the bulk of this, it's leaving you very little space, which is that third place, your germane load, where you are actually thinking about whatever you're putting yourself forward for or whatever is going on and being able to make a decision. So by reducing your cognitive load in the right area, you create space to make it, to really think something through, to make a decision as to whether or not this is something you can do. And it's not rocket science, it is basic psychology.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what both of you mentioned, and the way we communicate both in a written form and oral form. And I I would like to add here maybe one layer, which I think is relevant in clinical trials. It's the emotional part, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you read an ICF and it can be understandable for a person that it's not impacted by the disease, but simply because of the fact of knowing that you're going to engage in a clinical trial, that maybe it's your kid, so it's a lot of emotional load there.
Yes.
So I think also the emotional part has a lot of impact in, and that's why it's really important to engage with the patient and explain that oral communication. I think it supports a lot to provide the necessary verifications or explanations.
Yeah, and then I would like to add, like the ICF is not just a document, you know, actually it should be a conversation with the doctor about everything that is in there. I know that this doesn't always happen, and this is actually really, this is something that is absolutely no-go. Obviously legally too, but also human, like on a humanist perspective. And, but then it comes also, language goes further. Like if I hopefully have that talk with my doctor, I need someone who has a positive body language and who really takes time to care and to listen and to answer, not just to tick a box, you know. Yeah, I talked, I asked if they have questions. Then again, you get all this information, then you should have a day or two to digest and then come back and then ask your questions again. Of course, we write that in the ICFs. I know that it doesn't always happen like that. Doctors are always in a rush, you know, they are always sorry. And this is something that is, besides clinical trials, always a topic. Body language and also attention. And when I say attention, also, I wanted to mention that the new generations, like me and younger, they have already a very low attention span thanks to social media. And this is also where that comes in what Keith said, the bullet points, the headings, the subheadings. We need to write in block style because dense text can't be digested by anyone anymore. And this is also in our book. I think we kind of started writing in block style. You know, we had a lot of subheadings and headings just to make it easier to go through it and also go back and find very fast something that I was looking for instead of searching through the whole dense text. So yeah.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is, you know, emotional load is very high because you're dealing with the medical condition, the hopes and promises, the unknown, the uncertainty, and this is where trust models really come in, because you know, you can reduce the emotional load by providing that level of trust that people can infer through what you do, how you speak to them, how you act. You know, it's not just about how you present the patient information sheet. It's about how you interact with a person when you meet them for the first time in a trial. It's about the small little bits of information that you retain, that you share back. You know, I've met amazing patients over the years that have been involved in trials that I've been part of. And I mean, I've got one that still today sends me a calendar every year. You know, the trial was 12 years ago.
Wow.
And, you know, it's just because of the small nuances about what goes on and how life is. You know, think about your day-to-day relationships with people. You're just transferring this now to a work setting. And I often say, we're not making sausages or plates or like something that goes down a factory line. There's a human involved in every aspect of this. Someone working in the clinic may be having a really bad day. Patients also need to acknowledge that, you know, their jobs are stressful. You know, something I speak to people about that say, oh, I wish pharma would do X, Y, and Z, and they blame pharma. I said, stop pointing the finger and start saying, this is how we could together change it. Because if you point the finger, you put someone on the defensive. But equally, what was so important in the book to make sure we had some voices coming out of pharma was, no, I'm yet to meet someone that has gone to work in the biotech or the pharma industry who works there for the wrong reasons. It is an industry where you are more likely to fail than succeed because most drugs do not make it to market. So you have to be a pretty tough individual. Yes, people get remunerated well. Yes, drugs are way too expensive and far more expensive than they should be. But the people that are turning up every day to do this work are either motivated because there's a personal touch, family member themselves, whatever, or they have a desire to make something better. So, you know, the emotional load that you talk about, think about all of these things as well, and it will reduce some of the burden that you're feeling, because actually there is this amazing ecosystem, whether it be community groups, the clinical sites, the other patients, guardians, advocacy groups, and the biopharma industry, who are all pulling in one direction. Everyone's got the same goal: rid these people of this disease.
Yeah, I love the way you put this into perspective. Thank you for...
Yeah, wonderful said, Keith.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you mentioned something there, that some of the clinical trials don't get to the results we expect from the beginning, right? So there's one chapter in the book that you mentioned, you refer to as clinical trial seeds for tomorrow's medicine clinical. And this is something that really I particularly liked and caught my attention, because you put this perspective, the positive perspective, right? Even though there are clinical trials that don't get into a positive result, they do have they do have their own role, right, in learning from failures, if I can say, or mistakes, or simply advancing and see what's not working. And can you maybe share more from your perspective on this, of having clinical trials as seeds for future?
Yeah, I think let's deal with both sides of it. So I've been involved in 700 plus studies in my career. Of that, I think 13 drugs have gone to market, which is still a lot. But the majority didn't make it. Now, that doesn't mean that they were a waste of time, because for some people they were helpful at that time. And for others, they didn't. They weren't helpful. I mean, I remember one study for multiple sclerosis where there was a placebo involved, yet all 60 patients said they all felt better. Now, you know, you alleviated some of the burden that these people felt at the time. But ultimately, that drug failed. That drug was stopped at the end of that study and didn't progress. Then there are other drugs that are in development at the moment where, you know, I had a conversation with an amazing lady a few weeks ago where she said, and this was for a bleeding disorder. So she has a bleeding disorder. There is a drug being trialed at the moment and for von Willebrand's disease. And she said, you know, what would be amazing is in a few years' time, if this drug makes it to market, I won't have to travel 2-3 hours to a hospital further away because my local hospital cannot deal with my condition now. I will be able to take that medication and then go to my local hospital, and that makes any procedure I've got to go through much more manageable. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with failure if you learn from it. There's a problem with failure if you just ignore it and try and bury what's gone on.
Yeah, it's like in real life, like every time when you fail, you have to, get up again and keep going, but also look back, like, what could I do better next time? Or like, where could I improve? Or the thing I did, or whatever, the friendship that broke, or the fights that my kids have at school. It's hard sometimes, but you gotta learn out of it, you know. And I really like what Keith said again, and it's something that I think that needs to be highlighted when we talk about failure in clinical trials, is that even if I was on a trial that failed, people took data, and this data will be helpful for future trials. And maybe that makes me feel less like a failure myself if I'm as a patient in there. Yeah, there are many things that people who are not involved in the decision making about a clinical trial never consider. And I must say, even writing the book, I learned, I learned a lot, and I also learned different perspectives thanks to Keith and his experience. So I really loved writing this book because it was a learning process for myself as well.
I mean, that's the other thing that people kind of forget about clinical trials. You go into a clinical trial and you get this different type of medical care. There are patients that we've worked with that their standard of care was to see their clinician every 6 months. Now in a clinical trial, they're seeing doctors every week, couple of days, 2 months, whatever it happens to be. And so you do get that enhanced level of care. I know that from some of what the amazing group I worked with previously these clinicians did prevent hospital admissions that would have otherwise happened had these people not been in clinical trials. And that wasn't even necessarily because of the drug. That was just because of the enhanced level of care, because not all of the patients were on an active drug, some were on placebo. So there are a lot of less tangible benefits to taking part in a clinical trial. Would I take part in any trial? Absolutely not. Would I take part in the right trial? Yes.
Yeah, also something that needs to get attention is there is not just interventional trials where I have to take something. Even if you take part in an observational trial where we just look at you, and try to figure out how does this circumstance bother you or your body or your blood pressure or whatever value we are measuring. So that is something that people also need to have in mind. They don't do anything with me except that I get better care and more monitoring, and maybe someone finds that my liver values, like in the blood, is too high, and which my GP wouldn't have seen, or maybe half a year later, and then so observational studies are correct me if I'm wrong, but without risk, because I don't need to take anything, but it helps a lot to collect data.
And it provides a baseline. I mean, I work with one, they are a Danish US company focused on bleeding disorders. And, at the center of everything they do is understanding people's baseline and collecting that information, not to have data, but to inform how best to help manage that person if they do then go on to an interventional trial. And looking at how we act and be in real life, as opposed to this clinical trial setting, which is a forced setting always. So I think Kathrin's right. There are lots of opportunities to contribute to research. It doesn't always have to be through an interventional trial, i.e. one where you're taking a new medication or you're trying a new medical device. It can be an observational study. It could also be a real-world evidence study where you're just looking at how you are on standard of care. It could be, a early access program. Ultimately, every person who enters into, I would like to consider a clinical trial, should have an outcome. That outcome may be, none of this is for me, but there are multiple other outcomes along the way. It's not a binary, I take a new drug or I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great to emphasize on that. And as we get closer to the end of this interview, you mentioned in the book that it takes courage and hope to take part in a clinical trial, and I think that you did the same with the book. It took a lot of courage, passion, and hope, and that's something that we, the readers, can only thank you for. But I'm really curious to know: are you intending? Is there a second book coming? Are you thinking of writing something more on it about the topic or extend the?
Well, I have many book ideas, but yeah, it's not, it's not easy to find the time to write books when you also need to do your regular job. But I have a lot of ideas. We haven't talked yet about a second one that we want to write together. I don't know. Let's see.
Well, I would like to. I think that, there are topics that we haven't really gone into because the landscape is changing, and it's changing very quickly. And I think technology is becoming a far more important partner, and I do think it's a partner than it was in the past. And as we move into this new era where AI is critical, it's critical to everything we do in our business. AI is not a feature, it is the platform that we built. And it's going to become more and more important in medicine. It will mean that we don't have to do some of the work that we've done. So for me, it's looking at how has the landscape changed and really, what should we be looking at? So maybe I think this time I would like to do a more practical book for the biotech industry. The first one was for people who are considering clinical trials, but I think, how do we humanize this a bit more on the biopharma side of it, and move to that actionable insight. Next week I'm speaking with a few colleagues at a conference. We're talking about patient engagement, and we're still having to put up on screen a definition of patient engagement. That tells me we're not even close to where we should be. So yes, another book.
That's great. Looking forward to it. And before we close, I think that the book is available as an ebook, right? And if someone wants it in a paper format, they can order. But we're going to put a link in the description of the episode. But can you also maybe briefly mention, if someone is interested, where can they find more information about the book or order it?
Well, information you find on my website, www.katrinkunze.com. And there's one page where we explain a bit more about the book. But you can buy the book on Amazon. Very simple. Clinical Trials, Science Field Recruited. Or type one of our names in and then we will come up. Yeah. And then you can order it in paperback or in ebook, right?
Or just reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's Keith Berelowitz, and I'd be happy to talk to you about your journey, the book, whatever it happens to be. I never say no to a conversation.
Yeah, same.
Perfect.
And we also agreed on if there's like let's say a language school or because we also have a glossary, a very like a 3-page glossary with all the clinical terms. I always have the linguists in mind. If there is like an institution who would like to have like more than 10 books, then we are also happy to provide discounts to get the book in the right hands.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing the details and for making yourself available for doubts, queries, or even requests from people in the audience. And I would like to just give you a couple of more minutes if there's anything you would like to share or invite the audience, or some pieces of advice from your experience in writing the book, the content.
Well, as Keith said, or as I also mentioned, I do have mentorship. I offer mentorships. So if you want to dig deeper into the topic and need some guidance as a linguist, that should be me. If you want to be more on the academic side of things, maybe Keith.
Yeah, and I think my parting thing is. It's your journey, and we're here to support it along the way. If there's questions, come ask. If you're comfortable just reading the book, read the book. If the book's not useful to you, just look at everything that is put in front of you. And you know, something that we focus on within my company is just a very simple saying, which is understanding comes first, decision follows. And that's really, for me, speak to Kathrin, speak to Anke. Anke, thank you very much for having us on. But take your time. There's no rush.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least in most cases, there's no rush. But take time relative to what you can, because these are big decisions to make. And for anyone that has listened to what I've said out there, thank you. I do appreciate it.
I do. I'm sure they will listen to you.
Thank you
Well-
so much, both of you. Yeah, it was a lovely conversation, and I really enjoyed the entire conversation, the dialogue, your ideas, and I'm sure that the audience will find a lot of interesting ideas, and I hope they also reach out to you to extend a bit more the awareness about patient engagement, and that clinical trials shouldn't be something we're scared of.
Thank you, Anke, for having us.
Yeah,
It was a
thanks,
pleasure.
Really appreciate it.